So another great option for composting, especially in a cold climate, is vermicomposting, or composting with worms. But these aren't your typical earthworms that you'd find in garden soil. These are called red wiggler worms, and they're more surface dwellers. They like to dwell in the top 1 or 2 inches of soil just below the leaf litter. But in this context, we actually have those red wiggler worms in a bin. This is a great indoor option because the red wiggler worms are just breaking down your kitchen scraps. And similar to an outdoor compost pile, you're going to have to think about the same factors when you're building a worm bin. So for a worm bin, you want your kitchen scraps are your greens, so your material that's high in nitrogen. Your newspaper and your cardboard are your browns, which are the bedding for the worms. Then you want to have an adequate moisture, so moisture like a wrung out sponge, again like your backyard outdoor compost pile. And then you want to break up all of those materials, chop up your kitchen scraps, shred up your newspaper so that the worms can break it down more easily. And then finally, this as well is an aerobic with oxygen process, so you want to encourage air into this bin. So there are several different options for bins. You can buy a pre-made bin like this one, which is like a worm hotel. This one's called Wormtopia. There's also something called Canna Worms. So you can buy these online, and they're often available at garden stores as well. But they can be quite expensive. So another option is just to buy a tote and drill a bunch of holes in it, again for aeration, and also on the top. And then you want to make sure that it's shallow because, again, these are surface dwellers. You don't want a really high tote. And then you would put the bedding material in here, and you would put your worms in here. So that's another great option, just a DIY type of tote. So then what happens is that the worms slowly break down the kitchen scraps and the cardboard and newspaper, and they convert that into vermicompost, which is a great nutrient-rich amendment that you can add to your garden soil. You can also make compost tea from this vermicompost, and you can also use it in your houseplants if you want as well. So a few things to keep in mind in terms of worms is that worms like it between 65 and 85 degrees. So again, this is something that you probably want indoors for most of the year. You can oftentimes have it in a garage if it's heated, or we keep ours, for example, in the basement. And in terms of this setup, as you get more kitchen scraps and more material, then you add layers to this Wormtopia. And the worms just crawl up and go towards where the kitchen scraps are so they can eat them and break them down. So I just want to give you a look into the worm bin. So here you can see the shredded newspaper that's moist like a wrung out sponge, and that's placed over top of the kitchen scraps that I have in the different corners. So when you feed the worms, you want to feed them in one corner first, then move on to the next corner, and then move on to the next corner. You don't want to put all the kitchen scraps in one area. And when you put the kitchen scraps in, you want to pull back the newspaper first, and then you want to put the kitchen scraps in there, and then put the newspaper over top of that. In terms of what you feed the worms, you want to feed them anything that you would normally put in your compost pile. So again, similar to an outdoor compost pile, you're not putting meat or dairy products in here, but the worms will eat most all the different kitchen scraps. What you don't want to feed them are things like onions, spicy hot peppers, so they don't like those, and just give them a minimum amount of citrus as well. And especially when you're starting out and you're establishing your bin, you want to put in just a handful of kitchen scraps to begin with, and then you want to monitor how quickly those worms break down that material, because you don't want to overwhelm them with too many kitchen scraps. So once you know that, then you know that maybe you can feed them once every week or once every couple weeks. Now, people sometimes get concerned that the worms are going to escape from the bin, and they rarely do that. If you create an environment that they like, where there's food, where the moisture is adequate, then they'll rarely want to get out of the bin, if ever. And even if they do, oftentimes that's just at the beginning of the process when they're getting settled into their bin. And then looking into my second layer here, you can see a bunch of the different worms and the partially broken down bedding. And again, these worms are really small. They're not like earthworms, they're much thinner and much smaller. And then lastly, in the last level, you can see the vermicompost that's fallen through all of the mesh down to this bottom layer. And again, this is nutrient rich. It can be added to your garden soil. It can be used to make compost tea. And again, you can use it on your house plants as well. Also, you can make additional compost tea by just pouring some water over top of this bin. And then the water will trickle down and it will collect in that last layer. And then you can decant it using this little spigot here. And then you'll want to dilute that. And then you can, again, use that in your garden or you can use that on your houseplants. So again, vermicomposting is a great option, especially in cold climates. It allows you to break down your kitchen scraps even in the wintertime when your outdoor compost pile is most likely frozen. And again, you can get these bins online or at a local garden store. And in terms of the worms themselves, you can also get those online at places like Planet Natural. But do check with your local community to see if someone else also has a worm bin and can give you some extra worms. So up next in my next video, we'll cover other soil building strategies.